base your purchasing decision off of what's in the market today for Salesforce. Okay. Whoops, wrong screen. Yeah, and so I introduced myself, Kevin. I'm on Twitter. Honestly, that's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Kevin J. Hill. My DMs are open. If you send me a message, I'm usually pretty good about checking those at least once a day. Email's a bit overwhelming. And I actually started doing open office hours. So I use calendly.com. Actually, I see Greg on the call here. He was, I think, one of the first folks to sign up. And I think I have some fairly friendly hours for your morning time. So usually 5 p.m. my time, which is a half an hour from now until I think 7 is what I've opened up Monday through Thursday. And this is just really one-on-one time. If you have questions almost about anything, that's great. I just love to learn about what you're building with anything Lightning Web Components or on Lightning. And if you have any challenges, I usually take notes and connect with the right teams so that I can give them more information about things that we can improve. But feel free to use that and sign up for a session. I'd love to chat one-on-one. This was me just, I got to go to the koala sanctuary, and I think it's called Lone Pines in Brisbane. Got to hold a koala. That was pretty cool. And then a picture of me with my daughter in Sydney. So that was just a little bit over a year ago. It was in January for the launch when I was out there. So I thought I'd bring those photos in to say, I wish I was actually there with you now versus doing the remote event. It's I'm sure the weather there is much nicer than it is here in the Seattle area, which is a bunch of clouds. But it was a lot of fun being out there. And so what I thought I'd do is talk, because this is like the one year-ish anniversary of us being live in market so that people could build on us and go through a little bit of that. You know, the launch was last January in 2019. And that was when LWC version 1.0 was out and available for people. We actually waited a little bit to open source the project, partly because we were doing a bit of cleanup and making sure that we had a website to kind of support developing in open source. I'm going to show a little bit of that website today. But that was around the TDX timeframe last year when we open sourced the actual Lightning Web Components project on GitHub. A little bit later in the year, kind of closer to the end of the year, we showed up with local development beta. And I'm actually going to demo a little bit in local development beta today and show how that's working. And that's also coming along. Like, we want to get that product to GA and enhance, but it's a very powerful tool. The other thing we did last year that I'm finding out is maybe we didn't advertise as well as we should have is we open sourced the base components. Not every single base component is open source, but quite a few are there. And that's the actual code that's running in our Lightning based components. And it's a pretty powerful tool if you want to see how we're doing things at Salesforce, if you want to take what we've done as a starting point and then develop on it further. At the end of the year, we actually opened up our design docs. So we publish our RFCs, which stands for Request for Comments. It's actually a very old format. I think it dates back to the 60s. We didn't invent this, we're just following it. But this is how we design a lot of the features for LWC internally, and we thought it would benefit to actually do that in the open. So I'll take a little bit of time to show that website and kind of point out a couple of the designs that are cooking that you might want to pay attention to or get involved in. And then just February this year, we released version 1.2 of Lightning Web Components. So this is kind of what the path looked like in 1 year. And you can see that our releases of LWC are really kind of tied to platform for the major releases. But what you don't see on this chart is like all the work we're doing in open source. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because it actually lets you see what we're doing before we do it. Okay. This is one thing I monitor just to see how is Lightning Web Components doing in the ecosystem. This is public data. You can go to the website. It's on NPM, and you can just search for the LWC package and get the download data. And so I actually use a website called npmtrends.com. I can send that link along so that everyone can take a peek at it if you'd like to. But 1 year ago, we were getting about 2,000 downloads a week, maybe just under that for Lightning Web Components. And you can see how, we've progressed over time. And, just last week we hit 16,000 downloads in 1 week. And every now and again, depending on holiday schedules and other things, you'll see the up and the down. In fact, this dip right here is December, Christmas time frame in the US. And what it tells you is just not a lot of enterprise developers write code around that time. But predictably, we're actually heading in a very positive direction and continuing to see more and more adoption in the real world. And this captures things that are happening within Salesforce and also anything that would be happening in open source. So I kind of use this as a leading indicator for adoption trends that are going on. Another thing that I look at is we have a little bit of telemetry within our CLI. And when I first started looking at this data around the LWC launch, it was actually closer to like 40% of the time Aura was created versus 60% LWC. And you have to keep in mind that the Visual Studio Code experience is going to get more LWC by default, because Aura developers will still use other tool sets, and also the developer console is a popular way to develop and update Aura as well. But we actually hit a fairly significant milestone. It's the fantastic 80-20 rule. So you can see right now about just under 20% of the time people are creating Aura components when using Visual Studio Code in the CLI, versus 81% of the time developers are creating LWC components. So that's another trend that I watch, is like, how are people using our tooling? VS Code is where we invest the majority of our time in making the tooling experience exceptional by making sure it's not doing anything proprietary for Visual Studio, but we use a lot of TypeScript in our development. So we expose those TypeScript types to Visual Studio, and that way autocomplete happens. We also invest in the language service providers, which is an open standard that Microsoft pushes, and it works really well in Visual Studio Code as well. So this is why you get kind of a premium experience there, and it does gear a bit towards LWC. But the trend is great. Like, it's gone kind of from this 40% Aura to 20% Aura. One thing that I'm really excited about, this is actually in beta now, is the Lightning Message Service. And if anyone's developed with LWC initially, we had to go out with this kind of, do-it-yourself solution using a pub/sub library that we made available. And you could do this pub/sub to communicate between components, but what Lightning Message Service does is it allows you to communicate from Visualforce into Lightning, and across from Aura into LWC and these sorts of things. And it's really a cool conduit for doing messaging, because you don't have to take that extra dependency on importing a pub/sub within each of your components and trying to make sure they're all using like the same pub/sub. Instead, you have a global pub/sub available through Lightning Web Component, and you can establish your channels through metadata within your package. And you can make your channels not be public and not be global, so you can still maintain kind of a private way to communicate between components. This is going to actually go and move to GA with the next release of Salesforce that rolls out, and currently it's in beta. And actually, what I like to do fairly early on is jump into a demo right away. And so what I'm going to do is highlight a feature that's only available right now in our open source project. And I talked about open source. Let me just bring in, I have one other browser window here. I just have to find it. There we go. So what I'm using here is actually on our lwc.dev website. And let me just show you that really quick before I jump into the code. So if you go to lwc.dev, this is the website we created for our open source project. And we actually have a very quick way to get started developing locally called Create LWC App. Anyone who's used like Create React App, it's sort of the same type of experience under the hood, where we do a lot of the setup and give you an application that's running and you get like live code reload when you hit save. So you can just do this npx command, create your app, and be up and running in a few minutes. I've already gone through that because nobody wants to wait for a couple minutes just for me to get set up. And right here, this is the basic app just running. What I want to show is a feature that we released called CSS Only Modules. So creating a Lightning Web Component, normally what you would do is create an HTML file and a JavaScript file. JavaScript file would have all the code logic, HTML file would have the layout. You were always able to create a JavaScript only module, which means you don't have any UI, you just want to ship some API. And actually, when I was in Sydney, I demoed a temperature converter that I created because Fahrenheit and Celsius are sometimes hard to navigate. And it was really hot in Australia. I think it was like 35 Celsius, which translates, if I do the math, roughly it's a little over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But that's why I made the component, so I could get a good conversion. Unfortunately, I had a bug in my conversion and somebody called me out on it. But anyway, the point was I made a library that was just doing those temperature conversions, like taking Fahrenheit and converting to Celsius, Celsius to Fahrenheit, and I could import that, and it was just JavaScript. So we always supported that. But what we just released support for is CSS Only Modules. So this here is a Lightning Web Component, but it's just a CSS file. And in the CSS file, you can see I have theme colors. So I have my theme 1, theme 2, and then I have something where I'm going to try and override a style. And just for fun, these can actually import other CSS only modules as well. So I have my cool theme that's being imported on top of my theme. So you can go in and add a whole bunch of theming logic that just translates. We've heard from a lot of people like everyone was copying and pasting their styles across different components, and this is meant to make that bit easier. So if you have a common brand that you want to carry, you could do that in this CSS only file. So this main component here, I'm going to show you, and I will zoom in so you can see this a little bit better if it's not. And so you can see here, I have got the My Greeting component, and that's just simply this, it's this, right? And so it's this message that cycles through and says hello in a number of different languages, and that's the Lightning Web Component I have. Well, maybe what I want to do is I want to apply a theme. Okay, well, if I look at my greeting, here I've got my normal CSS, I've got my animation logic, hide and show, but at the top I've said, hey, I want to import this theme. And you can see in the theme, it's got theme 1. So let's go and try this out. I'm going to go into my HTML file. You can see that I've already just kind of commented out a div. I'm going to uncomment that. And then I'm going to say, let's try theme 1 and hit save. And so you can see that this CSS file now imported. I've got a gray background and pink text because who doesn't want that? And then I could actually say, let's try theme 2. Save, and then that actually imports as well, and it does a high contrast theme. And then for my cool file, I think I made a class called Kirill because I was demoing this to one of my compatriots. Oh, maybe I got that one wrong. Let's take a peek. And let me try that one more time. Not sure why that didn't work. I must have messed something up for that. But what I can do, I'm going to go back, and I just want to show that this is just standard CSS. So I'm gonna just go back to my other theme 2 here, and we've got this loading. Now, what you might have noticed is in my theme file, I actually have a style called greet. And then I also have a style called greet here. This says the font size should be extra large. This says the font size should be small, but it's, of course, respecting the greet that's coming from my first file because it's just standard CSS. But I can do the ugliest thing in the world that you should never, ever do in CSS and say, this is the important rule, and then it behaves as you would expect, so you can do overrides. So this is working in open source today. So if you go use that create app command that I showed you here, and set this up. You can go and play around with the CSS Only modules, and it works without a problem. This is going to be coming in the summer release on Salesforce. So you'll be able to use this same sort of logic when you create components in an SFDX project and deploy it. Cool. Okay, this is one way you can do local development. And I actually use this quite a bit when I'm doing very quick prototyping for UI of components. But the downside is it's not actually hooked up to Salesforce data. And we'll come back to that in 1 second. So I'm going to take this away. I'm just going to go back to the slides for a moment. And so what we just saw is I'm able to go put my branding CSS logic into their own modules that I can import and have it go and put my styles into as many different controls as I want. So I can centralize all of the logic that I have. And then I showed this to you through open source because we check in our code to open source first, and then we integrate it into the platform for the build. I'm going to get back to that. Now, there's another way to also do, let me pull up my other editor. Sorry, I just have it on another monitor. Got to drag it down. Apologize for that. So what I've done here is I've actually pulled down the recipes project from GitHub. And so you can see I've got a whole bunch of components. And these components show like best practices on Salesforce. And it's a great project to go work in. But you know, the thing that I really dislike sometimes is having to push my code to an org. So let me get back to browser window. Now, what I've done is I've actually used a command to start a local development server within VS Code. And so you can see here, I've got one of the recipes. So this is working code on my box. It's local. And this is just showing our D3 charting example. And I could click there and go to the source code. But a cool thing is I could actually say, hey, I want to go take a peek at this code in Visual Studio Code, and you can actually see that it took me right to the source code on my LWC recipes project, because this is all running locally on my box. What localhost development does is a really cool thing. It actually goes to my org and it proxies data down locally for me. And so this actually even proxied down the D3 library that I had as a static resource, right? And so anything you upload as a static resource to your org, you can also use that locally on your machine. That's pretty cool. If I go back to the browser and look at this project, you can see that if I go to the home page, this is listing every single component that I have within this project. And I can actually click into these and get a preview. One thing, let me go and find a couple of these that are fun to show. Just one note, like some of these components are child components, and if I click into them, I might actually get errors because they're expecting an API to be passed down. So there's still some more things that need to happen within this experience before we go with general availability. But you know, I can just come into this hello component. That's the simple hello world component. First time it loads, it might go a little slower because it's trying to proxy the data. You can see that it just does this hello world. Again, I can quickly get to that code in VS Code and start editing happily away. Well, one thing I thought I'd try is, you know, when you're building things on Salesforce, a lot of times you're actually building with a record page. And so what I've done is I've actually published a couple of cookbooks, I call them, on my own GitHub page to talk about some interesting development scenarios. And this one, I have a little cookbook to show you how to build your own cheap record page, which I've already done. So what I want to do is I'm going to go find my record page component. There it is. And I'll go navigate to this. And this is actually loading a bunch of controls that I had designed to work on a record page. And you can see I've got this image control, and I can actually go and test this out as if it was on the page. And so I can see different types of styles of images. I can edit some of the data here live. I made this similar context control that I wanted to test out, like, hey, find any other contacts that are part of the same company that Jennifer's part of. You can tell I have a bug at the top here. It was showing the wrong name. So apologize for my bug. But I'm able to go do this locally on my machine without pushing my code to the org. And so you can see that we're making development on Salesforce easier and easier. And the way I talk about it is you get to save your code locally instead of push it. So that very first open source project I showed you where I saved and I got the instant refresh, we're making that more and more possible even with force.com data. And that's the power of local development. Okay, let's go back to slides. All right. Okay. Now, this is the one point I made a little bit earlier, is that we have this request for comments website up, and it's public. You can go to it right now. Like I can, I'm actually going to paste the URL, and you can check it out. And then maybe you find one that you want to ask me a question about. And of course, I'll navigate there live. Okay. So this is our live website. If you go there, you're not going to see some of these other tabs, but you will see the LWC tab. And you can actually see all of the requests for comments that we've made throughout the entire lifetime of this project. We tell you if we've implemented it, or if the design's just approved, or if it's something we've rejected. There you can see, why don't we do two-way data bindings? Well, you actually get to see the discussion that the team had about why we decided ultimately not to support two-way data bindings in Lightning Web Components. And then if we go into some of the more notable RFCs, right now, here's an active one that the team's really working on. You can see this was started in January, and it's focused on server runtime. What does this give us? Well, this is actually the start of supporting server rendered components for Lightning Web Component. And you could read through the design. What we're looking at doing is actually breaking out our engine into a couple of different modules. So we'll have our core engine, but then we'll have our engine that uses the DOM, and we'll have our engine that uses the server. So this engine right here expects that there's a browser present and it can use DOM APIs. This engine does not. This engine says, oh, I just expect that JavaScript's present. And so this whole design doc walks through all of the thinking we have, like what's our motivation for doing this? You know, within Salesforce, one of the biggest motivations is we have products that send email. And we want to make sure that Lightning Web Components can be used in constructing emails in a very drag and drop friendly way. But the scenario is these components aren't initially rendered in a browser. They're actually rendered on the server, and then a massive merge of data happens to where we generate all these emails that get sent out. And so you can read through all of the design considerations, but better yet, you can actually see the pull request for this RFC on our GitHub page. And this is all, again, public. You can see all of the discussions our engineering team, these are our direct engineers working on the core engine for Lightning Web Components. Ted's actually an architect that works on the community site. So it's crossed Salesforce, but you can see all the conversations that are going on. You could actually come and file some issues. And better yet, if you have an idea and you think we should implement, you could go write an RFC. So we talk about, like, what does it take to go write an RFC? Of course, you're going to have to accept our CLA, but then we give like a step-by-step guide if you're like, gee, it'd be great if you could go and do these things. But we're trying to be extremely open about what we're building and when. One of the things you might have noticed is the site is a little unruly. Like, that's a lot of things to cruise through and read. And so we are working on retooling this a bit to have a friendlier way to drill in. So if something's rejected, it'll be grouped or that. And so we should clean up the site. But it's an invaluable tool if you want to know what we're up to and actually what you could go and affect. And I think I called out a couple other, let me see what else I was calling out that's interesting to look at. So I clicked through the server runtime, and this is the start of server-side rendering. We also have an RFC out there on dynamic components. And I know I get questions on this all the time, like, why doesn't LWC support dynamic components? This RFC is actually the beginning of us supporting dynamic components. And we've just released this internally for now to get a couple of teams to go try this out. It's a little different than how Aura did it in the past. And we want to make sure that it's going to perform well and be easy to use at the same time. But this is a great thing if you're passionate about dynamic components. You know, you can go read the RFC. You can go and add comments. Track reform is another one. This one actually just landed. And it was a result of a Dreamforce session that we did with our architects, where we were talking to people about, hey, LWC just got out there. And if you've written any code, you know that you do the @track, and that tracks all the changes. But what we found out is like 90% of the time, people were putting track in front of everything. And we're like, well, that makes sense. Everything's reactive. So we actually made a change that was non-breaking to where you do not have to use track on simple properties by default. And that's what this RFC goes into. And it talks about, like, there are some more advanced data objects where you do need to use track. But in general, like, we're trying to move this even into an easier state where by default, we assume that you want any changes to cause a re-render of the DOM. So these are three notable RFCs, but you will find there's actually quite a few that are in draft state that would be interesting to some of the core things we're doing with the Lightning Web Component engine. Okay, but more importantly, where are we going? And this is something that we actually chatted about a little bit at Dreamforce. We did a session called Lightning Web Stack. This isn't like the official name that we would go out with, I think, but this is the way we were starting to talk about how we're evolving what we're doing with Lightning development in general. And one thing that's really worked out well is web standards, right? Like, Lightning Web Component took a big bet on web standards and saying, we just want you to write the most modern JavaScript you can write, and we want to use classes and imports and modules and web components. You know, we want to use all the modern things that browsers provide. And this translates very well. We've seen incredible adoption. We've seen the majority of people shifting from Aura over to Lightning Web Components, and it just kind of like, wow, this is great. And so what we want to do is start doing the same things with other parts of our web stack. So Lightning Design System is already open source. Like, you can go use that design system. It's already there. It was actually there before Lightning Web Components. But you can imagine Lightning Locker. Like, we want to make this a module that you could go use within your own web applications. Lightning Data Service as well. So that cool @wire adapter to get at Salesforce data, actually this project was designed to be open sourced first, meaning if you have a definition for your API that's written in OpenAPI or RAML, which are two popular ways to describe APIs, the Lightning Data Service can actually go and automatically generate your wire adapters for LWC components. And so this is something that we want to open source so that more people can take advantage of it. And then we're working on what I think is a really cool piece of technology called the Lightning Web Runtime. And what this is doing is it's trying to be super intelligent about which pieces of Salesforce that you might want to use and which pieces you might not want to use. And so what did the path to Lightning Web Stack look like? Well, if you rewind and go back a long time ago when we were building Aura, and this is almost 10 years ago now, we said, hey, we want to re-envision Salesforce. We want to build it to be a spa application so we can get some rich client-side interactions and not everything coming back to the server. And so we built Sales Cloud and Services Cloud and Communities, right? And all of these were built on top of that core application stack of Aura. But if you go and look at what these experiences really need, you can see that in the Communities use case, what they actually were trying to do is make it a consumer web application, which meant page load time became more and more important, because when you're going to a website that you want to be fast and instant load, and you're not thinking gosh, I got to go authenticate into this, and there's a lot of work. You want it to be fast. So communities actually started taking a lot of the code out of Aura and saying we don't need this and optimizing piece of it. But the problem when you're trying to go and do this with a monolithic web application is that you can only gain so many efficiencies because you're still beholden to the fact that we return the full stack to you. And really what communities needs, of course they need components. Of course they want Lightning Data Service and they want a builder experience. But optionally, they want SLDS. Because like in a community site, you don't necessarily want it to have the look and feel of Salesforce. You want it to have the look and feel of your brand. And then Locker might be optional too, because if these users are coming in unauthenticated and you've protected your data anyway, you really might just be showing them like some informational pages and integrating a bit of data. And so you could say, we don't really need Locker for that. And you might actually want to have other third-party libraries that don't play well with Locker, right? And so communities was really pushing the direction for this. And they said, hey, you know what? This Lightning Web Component stuff looks great. What we'd like to do is build a Lightning Web Component first experience. And so they actually pioneered this notion of Lightning Web Stack. I give a lot of credit to the communities team because they're like, their scenarios are like, we got to be fast, and this is a way to get faster. And it gets rid of more and more code and more dependencies. And so the local development server that I actually demoed to you is one of the things that we built on top of Lightning Web Stack to begin with. So communities started this project and were like, wow, this is great. Like we can go build experiences like this. And then they took that same code base and they said, we're going to go and build like a full Lightning experience, but only the pieces we need, right? So we actually have a few things that are coming out in market today. Like communities is going to be making a big push to get initially out this notion of Lightning Web Stack on communities, and you should see that speed and performance is one of the primary things that comes of that. But it's really saying we want to make the modules, the big modules of Salesforce available and configurable as you go build experiences. And you're going to see that culminate in quite a few open source projects that we have coming out of the pipe. And just to kind of do a refresher of what that looks like. So SLDS is already out there. Lightning Web Components is out there. The Lightning Web Security, so Locker will have something that will be out there as well. The Lightning Data Services coming online, and then the Lightning Web Runtime that kind of glues this all together and lets you easily do the configuration is coming out as well. Okay. And actually, that's the bulk of my content. I did want to leave some time for questions because I know we have quite a few people online, and it's been a while since I've connected with the folks down under. So is it all right if we open up for any questions?
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for running the session. It's really useful. And people feel free to either post your questions in the chat window.
And your questions don't have to even stay to what I was talking about. If you have other questions, I'm happy to go into other topics.
Yeah, hi, Kevin, Nikhil here. So my question is related to CSS module that you just explained.
Mm-hmm.
What my understanding is, when you talk about CSS modules, it will not allow your CSS to be hosted, like it will be within the same component. The scope will be in the same component. But the way you explained right now and you showed in the debugger, your CSS class name is remain the same, and that's why your theme CSS is overwriting that CSS. Ideally, when we are using the CSS module, that CSS name get converted into the random generated name, and that will not allow the theme to overwrite your color. When we talk exactly what is CSS modules, like in style components you have heard of, in style components, that is another CSS in JS approach in which you can pass the props to the CSS.
Yeah. So let me rewind one sec. So you're saying that you're auto-generating your class names.
Yes, because my understanding of CSS as a module means your CSS scope is within that component and none of the other CSS can override your class.
Well, no, you can overwrite it, but what I was trying to say when I was showing CSS overriding. So this is my theme, right?
Yeah.
And I have a greeting. But when this CSS gets compiled, the file that's importing, its class by default is higher up, so it's important. I can always decide to override by saying, hey, this is actually the important style. But all I was saying is it behaves just like you would expect CSS to behave if you're importing multiple CSS files, like on a normal web page. It's the same behavior. So we're essentially just putting it at the bottom of your CSS file. So you can override the existing styles, but you have to do it with like a bang important if you're doing it that way. But your other point or other question was around dynamically generated class names.
Yeah.
And I didn't quite follow what you were asking there.
Because I'm mainly from the front-end development side. So when we talk about CSS modules, we mainly talk about like your CSS names will dynamically convert into some random generated string in your DOM. And that will solve the issue of your important as well as your like overriding issues, like if you look into the CSS modules.
Yeah, and I think maybe we're using two overloaded terms. When I'm talking about CSS Only Module, I should have said CSS Only Component versus the term.
That's right.
Yeah, so I apologize. I get where some of that confusion is coming from now that you're mentioning that. So I'll be a little bit more precise when I talk about it. This is just one other tool you have, and it was really addressing the scenario where maybe what you were actually doing is you were taking like all of these theme colors and then pasting them in a bunch of different components. And so it solves that particular scenario. But one of the things we are working on, and we will have some more guidance on out there soon, is an appropriate way that you can override all of our styles using CSS variables. And so we're doing a lot with styling. This is just one small tool, and it's really to solve that problem where you had kind of branding themes that you were sort of copying and pasting across components. So instead of doing that copy and paste, you're like, well, I'm going to import my cool theme. And then if you ever wanted to change your theme, you could import another theme. And then there's another question posted. Go ahead. Will the community's runtime come more into line with the Lex runtime and therefore functionality more consistent? For example, Quick Actions API is not available in communities. Also, other Lex end user tools, utility bar macros. That's a big question. The answer is, in short, yes. Everything is coming more and more in line, and it's kind of with this notion of Lightning Web Stack. Now, and also another thing to call out is the Quick Action API right now isn't in LWC, so you still have to have that OR wrapper. We're actually working to get the Quick Action API available in LWC first, so you can have only LWC components and Quick Actions within the next release. And then utility bars and macros, some of those APIs are also on track to come across. The other thing you're calling out, though, is like the difference between what's in communities and what's in core Lex. And yes, we are trying very hard to reduce the differences between those, but it's definitely not an overnight problem. One example is we're looking at all the builders. So across Salesforce, there's, I don't know if I can count them all. There's a lot of different builder experiences that were built on different technologies. The new builder is actually building on top of this Lightning Web Stack that I talked about as well to try and unify those. And by unifying some of these bigger pieces, it becomes easier and easier. But within communities, there are some different behaviors around what's passed down through pages versus what's also passed down through pages in Lex. And we're definitely trying to reduce those. But I don't have a more specific answer because the question was kind of a big question. But that's a great question, Gary.
Hi, Kevin. This
Hi.
is Matt Robertson here.
Hey, Matt.
We do sort of communities is being more and more used, especially customer communities, and it's a bit more of a platformy question with LWC. But the question comes more, do we develop it on Salesforce or do we use another platform to develop it? And one of the things we always find a bit difficult is when you want these rich user UIs that aren't Salesforce specific. And I know you talked a little bit at the end about that, but I just wanted to know the direction, pulling in, there's so many frameworks and UI frameworks that are so feature rich, especially when you're with Angular and React and the components. And where does that bridge start to come around? It's great when you're in the SLDS world and Salesforce look, but it becomes quite difficult when you need to move out of that world.
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. And it's actually the heart of why I even work on UI frameworks. And so we've done a really, really good job in Lex to make everything super simple. You've got one design system, you've got a ton of base components, and then a massive number of experience components. But like you say, and we get this question quite often, like, hey, when I want to go maybe develop my own UI stack somewhere else, but then do integration with Salesforce through Connect or maybe even a Lightning App experience, what's that look like? And the truth is, like, there's no UI framework to rule them all, but we definitely, from that perspective, are trying to fill any gaps around what the capabilities of our framework are versus like a React or an Angular. And like in the example of Angular, I think you might say feature rich because it's this full stack and it's got like everything in it. Whereas React is focused just on the view, and then Vue is focused just on the view, but it's sort of the ecosystem behind it. So one of our strategies was really start open sourcing more of the projects that we're using internally. And this notion of Lightning Web Stack being the hub of where you could go and make all this stuff work. So we do have an effort where we're trying to make our components agnostic of framework and UI. And that's a challenging thing to do because it's easy to take a dependency on a design system. But within the notion of like Lightning Web Stack, if you wanted to use material design, we want to make that so easy that you can say, hey, I'm going to use material, and then I want to use a Salesforce button, but it looks like a material button. And we're not there yet, but these are projects that are definitely in the work, and we're trying to make progress towards it. And it's actually an industry problem because like even Google, if you look at what they did with material design, there's some things there where they made assumptions, and there's a little bit of JavaScript that you have to install to use material to get some of the animations and all of that. And so it becomes a hard problem to solve, but we're definitely working towards having the bare bones of what a button is and the bare bones of what all these controls are, and then layering a design system on top would be super simple. We're not there yet, but one of the starting points was doing the, let me pull up in the base components repo. I know, so if I pull up in the base components repository, oops, I always go into the wrong directory. That's the samples, and I want to go show you the source code. You can see all of the components that we've put out there into open source. Yes, these still use SLDS, but more and more, like, the reason you don't see all the components here is because some of the components we have still only work well on force.com. And we're busy trying to remove any of those dependencies so we can have a full component library. That's sort of step one. Step two is actually make it easy to go use and mix and match components. And the path that I'm going down right now is like, hey, we actually want to make it possible so that if you have any standard web component that exists today, that you could just reference that in an LWC template. So that's another direction we're going, future investment for technology. So I know I answered with a lot of sort of different things, but just to kind of summarize, like, you're going to see more open source projects from us that show like how we're doing things. And we're actually trying to also reduce any assumptions we have about design system and our own modules on Salesforce, so decoupling. And those are sort of the two big trends you'll see. And then the last one is like, hey, just make web components work across everything, right? Like, I actually think it would be really cool if you could use the ING web components in Salesforce just by referencing them. So those are the sort of the three things that we're focused on to make that dream come true.
That's awesome.
Sure. Hi, Digambar here. I have two questions.
Sure.
One is you can have Aura as container for LWC. That means you can include an LWC component within Aura, but not other way around at the moment. Do we know if Salesforce is working towards this?
I can actually answer that question and say there's no way we'll do that. And I mean it in a good way. Like, could we go do it? Yes. But then if we go do it, you actually start getting some of the same problems that we had with Aura. Like, one of the reasons we went and invested in LWC versus trying to change Aura is there were just a lot of assumptions made in how Aura components work that we couldn't change easily. Some of it is actually when you're like rendering an Aura component, it's non-deterministic of when you have to go back to the server to get some more data in a lot of cases. And that specifically, like dynamic components can make this super hard. So what we did is we said we wanted to make everything as deterministic as possible to get the rendering speed up. So we're not actually looking to try and make Aura work with inside LWC. But let me ask you a question. You said 2. I can't remember if you asked me 2 or 1. Is the reason you're asking this question because there's some gaps in Lightning Web Components that you would like to see filled?
Yeah, so of course, that's one reason. The other reason is that they're like, few App Exchange products, and those App Exchange products has just Aura component. They are yet to move to Lightning Web Component. Now, if we have to refer those components within our Lightning Web Component, that becomes challenge. You cannot simply do that. And I'll give you an example, right? So we are doing an integration with one of the barcode reader. And what essentially we want to do is we want to invoke the barcode reader from Salesforce. And of course, that will be a separate app, which will open the barcode reader, read the barcode, and give us the read essentially, right? What is happening right now? They are yet to move to LWC. So their component is still in Aura component. Now, to use that, what we have to do is from LWC, so we have to create another Aura component within which we are going to call it out. So from LWC to Aura, we have to jump, essentially redirect. And from there, it will go to their server, give data back, and from Aura back to LWC, which is our main component. So that's one use case which I can think of. And other use case which probably I can think of is probably when we have some historical Aura component already built and we want to reuse it, right?
Yeah, no, and I do get that is a real use case. Like Salesforce itself is going through the same process. Like we're not rewriting every single Aura component into LWC. We're doing the ones that make sense. Like all new components, for sure, we're starting with LWC, and any of the other ones we evaluate interop. But one of the things out of the gate is we wanted to make sure that there was a strong interop layer, and we've actually only made that stronger, especially with Lightning Message Service. So yes, theoretically, there's a little bit of code change, but you can make that message boundary very strong without having to write a lot of extra components. But sure. I would love actually maybe grab an office hour with me and we can talk a little bit more in depth on this, because I'd love to make sure I'm not glossing over your scenario.
Sure. And one more question on the same line. At the moment, there is no chatter component, right, supported within LWC. However, it is within Aura component. And we have a use case wherein we have to include chatter within our component, which is LWC. And unfortunately, we cannot do it. So the way around which we have is the outer component is going to be Aura. And within that component, we are going to have LWCs and one of the chatter Aura component essentially. So we are trying to move from Aura into LWC, but because of some of the gaps, we have to circle back to Aura component.
Yeah, and definitely I understand that. Interesting thing is I know Chatter team has been busy like rewriting in LWC, and so it's like a point in time before they release an update. But it's a good data point to maybe help push that along faster and prioritize it. So like, yeah, definitely grab one of the 30-minute office, I guess I call it office hours, but it's 30 minutes. One of the office hour session that's 30 minutes with me, and we should chat a little bit deeper about these things just so I can tag the right teams on it internally and give them your scenarios.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We have any other questions online, or?
Are there any other channels, Kevin? Like office hours is one. Is there anything in the Trailblazer community, any specific chat groups, or anywhere people can come and have a chat with your team?
Yeah, so for my team specifically, the best two avenues are GitHub. So go to our core LWC GitHub repository, and that's LWC GitHub. And feel free to open issues, or like you can chat with us this way. That's one way to chat, but this is more like an engineering chat. office hours is like a direct line into me and my product team, essentially, because I end up pulling them in if I need them to pull in. You can always post in almost any of the Trailblazer communities that have to do with UI development. We have people that monitor and respond to those. The second place that we actually spend a lot of time is Stack Exchange. So the theme, if you didn't hear it, is I like to make sure that we're doing as much on the open as possible so that it accrues a lot of value. But if you go to Stack Exchange, the Salesforce Stack Exchange, and look for the Lightning Web Components tag, we're pretty active in triaging and responding. I think you'll see a couple that I've responded to and answered. But these are really good ways to get direct interaction with our team at scale. If you have like specific scenarios, this is the perfect reason I set up sort of those office hour sessions, because not only do you get my time, but I take notes in a QuipDoc and I tag people on Salesforce that own the areas that you care about if I myself can't like affect it on a day-to-day basis. So I think those are the best avenues to like engage with our team at scale and then also get one-on-one time.
That's great. That's great. I think we are almost time.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kevin, for really taking time after hours. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks for having me. I have been doing a lot of virtual events lately, I'm sure as everyone else has. I can't wait until one day I can come out to Australia again. If I do in person, I'd love to come to another group locally and maybe even do a bit of a hackathon or something like this. That sounds like a lot of fun to me. So I'm just itching to get out of my house one day.
Everyone does. Thanks everyone for joining us. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach me and Yanis in the Sydney Developer Group forum, or get Kevin in Twitter.
Yeah. All right. Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. And have a beautiful day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks everyone. Cheers.
Kevin.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.